welcome to another installment of We the People. I'm Rick Graber, president of the Bradley Foundation. Thanks so much for joining us. Matters of justice and the rule of law in America have been at the center of protests and debate this year. In cities large and small, the image of America on fire tells us that the principles of American exceptionalism really are under attack. And the rhetoric surrounding the recent United States Supreme Court vacancy also illustrates the country's troubling polarization. With me to talk about these topics is Andy McCarthy, a best-selling author, contributing editor at National Review, and a senior fellow at the National Review Institute. As a former chief assistant United States attorney in the Southern District of New York, Andy led the terrorism prosecution against the Blind Sheikh and other jihadists for conducting a war of urban terrorism against the United States. Andy provides analysis and commentary on national security, radical Islam, law, politics, and culture for numerous media outlets, and has recently authored the book Ball of Collusion, The Plot to Rig an Election and Destroy a Presidency. Andy, welcome. Great to have you with us.
Rick, it's always a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Absolutely. Let's jump right in and let's talk a little bit about the social unrest that has unfolded across the country the last several months. Here in Wisconsin, people really were shocked to see images of Kenosha, of all places, burning to the ground. It seems that there's been a quick rush to judgment when it comes to cases that involve the police. What are the implications from your perspective when respect for the rule of law just breaks down, and what happens when parts of our society refuse to consider evidence and facts?
Well, Rick, this is something that I ended up having to consider back in the 1990s, even though it was not something that would ever have otherwise occurred to me, because I was kind of, Attorney General Barr talks about meat and potatoes crimes. I was a meat and potatoes prosecutor for a long time, up until the World Trade Center got bombed. And then I was sort of thrust into this whole different arena of national security. And when you're dealing with that kind of a breakdown of law and order, whether it's caused by, an immense stream of violence or the kind of events that we've seen over the last few months, the thing that you have to grapple with that you don't otherwise grapple with in day-to-day law enforcement is the actual breakdown of order, which seems like a kind of a fundamental thing, but what you quickly grapple with is that the police are capable of maintaining law and order as long as you have a presumption of it in the first place. That is, as long as everybody thinks that the laws are going to be enforced. Once that breaks down, you really don't have a law enforcement problem anymore, because it's not possible for the police both to stabilize an insurrectionist kind of environment and enforce the law at the same time. And I think that's why we've had so much debate over whether President Trump should send in the military or the governors of the state should call in the state militias. You have to restore order before you can enforce the rule of law.
Related topic, there's just been a huge spike in crime in major cities this year. Take Chicago. Homicides are up 52%. In fact, there have been more homicides in Chicago so far this year than in all of 2019. Yet that doesn't seem to spark the same sort of outrage as incidents that involve the police. What's going on there?
Well, look, I think this is something the Bradley Foundation's been very concerned about for years and years, something we at National Review are very concerned about and have written about. And that is when you move the society from one where what we're concerned about is a search for the truth, and instead what you substitute is a narrative, and then you try to array reality to be sort of supportive of the narrative, and whatever facts don't fit, you just toss them out, or you contort them, or you do whatever you do to them. This becomes a big part of the problem of disorder. And I think if you look at the actual hard statistics, and I don't think anybody in America has done a better job on this than Heather McDonald has, but if you look at the actual statistics, the incidences of police violence against minorities, and in particular against young Black men, are infinitesimal, really statistically negligible compared to Black on Black violence or minority on minority violence. But it doesn't fit the narrative. The narrative that the
Yes.
media wants to run with is that there is a police war on young Black men and they're being hunted down. And obviously the statistics don't bear that out. The actual reality doesn't bear that out. But the real tragedy of this, as Heather points out all the time, is that the reason we know about crime rates and offense rates is because crimes have victims. And the most victimized populations in America are those who live in these minority neighborhoods. So when the police step back, as they naturally do, if they think that doing policing is going to get them in more trouble than anything else, those communities are the ones that are most ravaged and victimized by it. So it's really a vicious cycle. And the implication of your question, I think, couldn't be more right, which is we have to get back to a fact-based, rational society rather than a narrative-based society.
One more related question. There's been a lot of focus on Antifa as a result of the riots that have taken place in places like Portland, Oregon. The FBI director recently said Antifa is a real thing. It's not a group or an organization, it's a movement or an ideology. And you've written that the FBI's characterization is not only right, but it's progress. Elaborate on that. What did you mean by that?
Well, I have this, you were good enough to mention my books, and I have these books laid out. One of them that I wrote a few years ago, I think it was about 2010, is called The Grand Jihad. And it was about Muslim Brotherhood ideology and the Sharia supremacist ideology that was a real driver of jihadist violence. And for those of us who are on the front lines of that, going back to the early 1990s, the endlessly frustrating thing was that the government did not want to come to grips with what the ideology is that was driving the violence. And one of my big complaints, having seen this up close, was always that if you didn't do that, you couldn't effectively confront the threat. And if you think about it, we wouldn't have thought, for example, of confronting communism without understanding the ideology, or Nazism, or even the background of what drove Imperial Japan. We always went by the ancient wisdom that you have to know what you're dealing with in order to address it effectively. So I think when Director Wray says that Antifa is an ideology, and he qualifies that by saying, look, when I say that, it doesn't mean that we're not doing investigations and prosecutions of groups that self-identify as Antifa. What he's saying is, if your enemy is an ideological enemy, you have to grapple with that. And you don't want to delude yourself into thinking that if you prosecute 10 guys in balaclavas in Portland, that you've done away with the problem. Just like in the 90s, when our case about the World Trade Center bombing and the subsequent plot on New York City landmarks came out, what the government wanted to say is, this is a problem that's limited to a couple of dozen knuckleheads in Jersey City. And if we could just quell that, then we don't have a problem with radical Islam anymore. And that was a juvenile way to look at that. So I think if Director Wray is saying we have to grapple with the ideology that drives this, he's absolutely right about that.
Indeed. Let's move on to our court system. There's been a lot of concern that a Democrat-controlled Senate would end the filibuster, would add states, ultimately pack the Supreme Court. From your perspective, what are the dangers of court packing and ending filibusters and adding states? What's that do to our society?
Well, I'd say two important things about it. One is, and this goes to the theory of our constitutional system, which is separation of powers. The judiciary is an important apolitical or non-political check that we purposely insulate from politics in order to be the American people's ballast or bulwark against encroachments by the political branch, particularly on minority rights and our individual liberties. So the system is ingenious, but it's a very delicate balance. And what the framers always thought was that if too much power got accumulated in one set of hands of a government actor, or if you remove the functions that they laid out in the framework, the whole system could collapse. So the big problem with court packing, which notwithstanding some of the ways that it's been distorted in the last 10 days or so, court packing is, going back to FDR, expanding the number of seats. We're talking about the Supreme Court in particular, for the express purpose of putting your ideological allies in those seats with the expectations that they will produce outcomes that fit your political agenda. So the big problem with that is that it turns the Supreme Court, I think, forevermore from a legal institution into a political institution. And if the Supreme Court is just a super legislature that's expected to produce political outcomes rather than a rule of law geared institution, it can't perform the function that it's supposed to perform in our system. And that puts minority rights at risk. It puts individual rights at risk. It makes us more like a mob democracy. It basically means that, if somebody doesn't like the outcomes that a court is producing because it's trying to protect free speech or your privacy, if you've got 50% plus one, you can just roll over everybody's individual rights, which makes America not America anymore. Doesn't mean we'll disappear, but we'll be something innately different. And I guess the second point is, unfortunately, if they do away with the filibuster, the packing of the court may be the least of our problems, because then you will have no minority blocking rights in the Senate, which is what stops crazy ideas from being implemented by 50% plus one. It keeps us away from mob democracy. So if the Senate becomes the House and there's no minority rights, then it's not just court packing. They can enact their entire agenda. And what it'll mean, Rick, is that, if there's a public backlash to that and the Republicans get into power, if they don't restore the checks, and there'll be a lot of political pressure on them not to, because people will think you now have to swing the pendulum the other way, then we really have an unstable system, because we just gear back and forth depending on who's in charge. And it's not America as we know it.
Really troubling times, and it's just too bad that this kind of rhetoric is being talked about today.
Yep.
Let's talk about Amy Coney Barrett and her nomination to the court. There are lots of allegations and accusations out there, and I guess that's normal. But words to the effect that she's agreed to a litmus test that adheres to the Trump administration agenda. What about these allegations that her appointment would lead to the eradication of the Affordable Care Act and other major pieces of legislation that certain people on the ideological left don't like?
Well, Rick, we've talked about so much bad news. I think this is finally some good news we can talk about, because the sheer excellence of this nominee, I mean, so it's hard to put it any other way. Really, in my mind, having watched the hearing closely, made a lot of those things evaporate, a lot of these claims. She was very strong on the idea that there is no litmus test. That is, she didn't have to cut a deal with President Trump in order to get nominated. She didn't make any commitments about how she would rule on individual cases. She's not there to do policy. She thinks that what she's there to do is decide cases according to the law. She's not coming in, it doesn't matter whether we think the Affordable Care Act is a good idea or a bad idea. Her thing is it constitutional? Is it an appropriate rendering of the law? If it is, that's not the court's business to change it. That's what the political branches are for. So I think she was very good on that and allayed a lot of concerns, which is why you see this sudden swing in the polling. So that I think she's got there's a 20-point gap or something between with people who want to see her get confirmed, which anybody who watched that in a better time, Rick, that you and I remember fondly, she'd have been confirmed 100 to nothing. I mean, that's how it used to be in the old days before the court was so politicized. On the Affordable Care Act, I really think that's a frivolous claim. What the Democrats tried to do in the hearing, the Senate Democrats on the Judiciary Committee, was suggest that because President Trump has directed the Justice Department to be in court on this case, which challenges the Affordable Care Act, they thought that they wanted to frame it as Barrett was being rammed onto the court to be the deciding vote in that case to overturn Obamacare. And the reality is, as a matter of law, I don't think there's a single vote on the Supreme Court, whether or not Barrett were on the Supreme Court, to get rid of the Affordable Care Act in toto. There's a narrow issue about whether the fact that the individual mandate was zeroed out, which is to say, it's a tax, but they brought it all the way down to zero, whether that means because the court previously sustained the Affordable Care Act as a tax, is the fact that the tax is now zero, does that invalidate the mandate? And that may be an interesting question. I actually doubt that they're going to find that, even though the lower courts have. But that would only get you to the next question, which is, if the mandate goes, does the whole statutory scheme have to go? And there's not a single vote on the Supreme Court for the proposition that you'd have to throw out the whole statute, even if you find that the mandate is constitutionally invalid.
Andy, we've got time for one more question, and we would be remiss if we didn't talk to you a little bit about the Russia investigation. One of the latest developments that we've heard about in the news is that Attorney General Bill Barr has indicated that there will be no report or indictments filed by U.S. Attorney John Durham prior to the election. What do you make of all this? Where is this investigation?
Well, this is a real tension that I think has beset the entire time that Attorney General Barr has been in office, the 2 years, which is he's tried to do two things that have always been kind of contradictory. One is, and I think this is the most important one, he thinks that we need to get the Justice Department out of politics and the politics out of the Justice Department. We don't want the FBI and the Justice Department interfering in electoral politics. The FBI may very well have decided the 2016 election when all is said and done. If you think about how thin it was, that's terrible for the Bureau. It's terrible for law enforcement. It's terrible for our Republican democracy. So he wants to get out of that, and I think he's done an admirable job against a lot of blowback trying to do that. The other thing he's wanted, though, is we need to have accountability for what happened in 2016, which to my mind is a Watergate-style abuse of power, where the incumbent administration uses the intelligence and law enforcement apparatus of the government against its political opposition. The problem that Barr has is twofold. Number one, that would be regarded and covered by the media and understood by at least half the country as the most politicized prosecution of all time if they brought a case like that. And secondly, it's just a fact, and I address this a lot in Ball of Collusion, that not everything that's in the nature of abuse of power is a crime under the penal code. And most of the checks in our system against the executive branch overreaching or abusing its power are political. So Congress can strike their budget. You can impeach executive officials who abuse their power. But when you're talking about enforcing the law and national security, the people who we put in these positions have to have broad discretion to protect the country. And if you ever did have legitimately a situation where a political candidate was colluding with a hostile foreign power to undermine the American people or to undermine our election or other fundamental interests of the United States, the incumbent administration would not only have the power, they would have the responsibility to address that. So they have to have a wide berth to protect the country. I think people understand that, but the corollary of that is it becomes very hard to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that people acted corruptly or that they acted because they were politically motivated as opposed to they were worried about Russia. So you can spot easily, I think, an abuse of power, that doesn't mean that it's a prosecutable case in court. So that's what I think they're wrestling with. And he's also, Durham, who's got the investigation, has had bad luck. Once COVID hit,
Yes.
grand jury shut down, you couldn't travel to interview witnesses. So he's behind the timetable as well. But I think they realized that if they brought anything now, whether it's charges or a report, it would be painted in the media and understood by a lot of the country as a political ploy. And I think they feel they've done a good faith investigation. They don't want it to be seen that way.
Andy McCarthy, thanks so much for your time, your thoughts, your perspectives. We really do appreciate it. And thanks to all of you for listening in to this episode of We the People. We look forward to seeing you on our next episode. Thank you.